and welcome to Sheridan College Faculty Lecture Series. My name is Johnny Joyce, and I'm your host and facilitator this evening. Thank you for attending tonight's lecture in this online format and for supporting the Northern Wyoming Community College District during the COVID-19 pandemic. We would like to thank the Thickman Lecture Endowment for its generous contribution to the Faculty Lecture Series, which is designed to bring the scholarly expertise of the Northern Wyoming Community College faculty to the community. This series has been funded by contributions to the College Foundation from Muriel and Seymour Thickman since 2007. Tonight, we participate in From Many Came Few, Humanity's Rise, presented by B.J. Kristiansen. After his presentation, B.J. will answer your questions that you have provided via the Q&A or chat boxes in Zoom. You will find those controls on your Zoom control panel and may type your question at any time during the lecture. I will monitor those questions, and once BJ has completed his lecture, I will ask him for his answers. Now, a short introduction of our speaker is in order. B.J. Kristiansen was born in Norway and immigrated to this country when he was 5 years old. He grew up in Chicago, earned degrees in paleontology and history from Augustana College, and traveled to Wyoming while in his early 20s. He worked in the energy industry as a geologist for 25 years, working on drill rigs throughout the Rocky Mountain West. During that time, he also worked with Bighorn Coal, as well as Decker Coal, as a geologist and geo-archaeologist. He currently works for the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality, Land Quality Division, and is also an adjunct professor of anthropology at Sheridan College. He is a board-certified professional geologist and has two hobbies: building computers and researching human origins. Ladies and gentlemen, B.J. Kristiansen.
We should have put an applause track in there, you know that? One of the things that, as I was thinking about this topic, one of the things I found over the years as I teach my archaeology class and anthropology class is that students sometimes don't quite understand where they came from. And I don't mean last week or several generations ago. I mean thousands of years ago. What I like to do in my classes is give them a sense of human evolution as to where they come from and what we can expect now and in the future because of that. And so I put this together as an answer to some of the questions I'd gotten as to exactly who were our ancestors, where did they live, where did they go? And so I will go ahead and attempt to answer some of those questions, and we'll do our best to move forward. We've come a long ways as human beings, particularly in the last 12,000 years, ever since the agricultural revolution. We have achieved a lot, much more, I think, than any of us could have imagined early on when the human species was just getting started. One question out there, though, keeps coming up. We shared our world with other people, and I mean people, not species, not other creatures or organisms, but people. Why are we alone on this planet? Where did the people go? Why are the other human species no longer alive? Early concepts of evolution were pretty linear. When Charles Darwin introduced the topic, there was about a reaction in a lot of the different sciences to utilize evolution to describe a lot of their processes. Anthropology did it, geology did it, and paleoanthropology did it as well. And so early on, we got this fairly linear look at human evolution, starting on the left with Australopithecus, which actually in the original slide, this is actually an ape, it's a chimp. And then it shows Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, and Homo sapiens. And that was a pretty linear view of how we came to be. But over the years, we've begun to find out that it wasn't quite that linear, and it didn't quite happen that way. This is a better depiction of the human race as they ran through their lifetimes, starting with Australopithecus in the left and moving up to Homo sapiens in the right, just like we looked at in the other one. Only this time we look at a lot different picture than we did then. Different species, all meaning something. All these species on the planet at the same time, occupying the same spaces, achieving goals among each other sometimes. And what happened during that time period was instrumental in how we became to be and how we are in this world today. This is kind of a generic tree of life for genus Homo, which we belong to. A couple of different hominid ancestors are on here. Many of you have probably heard of some of these down in the Ardipithecines, way back 6 million years ago, coming up through the Australopithecines, 4 and 3 million years ago, till finally we get to genus Homo, which is the genus that we belong to, and have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different species within genus Homo. It seems like every year we get a new species showing up someplace around the world within that genus. So trying to keep this stuff straight is really pretty difficult from time to time because we keep getting information. And as information comes in, once again, we have to redraw this particular picture. So right now, this is about as close as we can get to looking at probably the direct sequence of events, although there are a lot of events that don't show up on this that happened at the same time. The first thing we know in these days is genetic information is coming fast and furious on a lot of these questions that we didn't know about early on. You can only do so much with fossils. You can only do so much with looking at the way people lived and looking at their homes and looking at the materials they utilized. You have to ultimately get down deep into their DNA to actually see what they were like, to see how close they may have been to us, to see what they may have been like in the world that they lived in, and answer questions that cannot be answered by all the other methodologies of determining the different methodologies that we utilize both in the past and in the present. Genomes of modern humans have shown some different things in the last couple of years and really opened up some doors for us to take a look at. We do know that modern humans mated with at least 2 groups of ancient humans, both the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. And some people say, who are those guys? And we'll try to answer that. About 4% of the DNA of European individuals, such as myself, with European extraction, have about 4 to 5% of Neanderthal DNA in their system. It came about somewhere in the past when Homo sapiens moved to Western Europe and began to interbreed with Neanderthals. Additionally, as we start looking at some of the other humans around the world, we find that between 4 and 6% of the genome of Melanesians, those folks that live out in the islands outside of New Guinea and some of those other places, actually have a lot of Denisovan genes in them, and their DNA has those particular groups of individuals as their forebears. And so what we see in our own genome is that there were individuals in the past, other species, theoretically, other species that we mated with and produced children with. And so they really influenced our lives to a great degree. About 300,000 years ago, let's take a look. Let's take a look at the slide of humanity that existed in those days. Of course, up in the left-hand corner, we have Homo sapiens, just coming onto the scene 300,000 years ago. Probably started about 325,000 years ago. The dates are a little bit shaky about that point in time, but by 300 years ago, they were pretty well established in northwestern Africa. We see the Neanderthals up in the left-hand corner as well, that were also in the world at that time. The Denisovans, Homo luzonensis, which is a brand new human species up there on the right-hand side. Down in the lower left, we had Homo heidelbergensis, Homo erectus as well. We also had 2 newer, or I should say more recently known individuals, Homo naledi down in the lower right corner and Homo floresiensis. These 8 human species were alive at the same time on this planet, generally occupying the same areas. The same geography was conducive to life for all these different human species at the same time. So we would have shared this planet with those individuals at that point in time. What I want to do is try to show you what it would have been like to have lived back in those days, to have these individuals as our next door neighbors and possibly as our mates as well. If nothing else, we know from the past that our human resources in those days was pretty generic, and the materials we had genetically were pretty small and when compared to other variabilities within other species. And so when we began with our very low species variety, we had a lot of newcomers and oldcomers on the scene to work with. quickly, this is what the climate looked like during that 300,000 year period. And the reason it's up here is because this is what changed us over time. This is what changed those fellow species, and this is what changed us, is those glacial periods during the latter part of the late Pleistocene, where there were long, long periods of cold and long periods of hot, 50 to 60,000 year intervals by and large. As you can see on the graph right there, we had those intervals of cold and hot in fairly regular order. We know how long ago these things took place because of two bits and pieces of information we can garner. Foraminifera, for example, can tell us what the temperatures were. Foraminifera are little single-celled organisms that live in the ocean, and as they die, they flutter down to the bottom of the ocean floor. They also produce oil when they're covered up by other sediments, and so they are really important in determining what the weather was like at the time. Also, the oxygen ratios between the two different isotopes of oxygen tells us a lot. The higher the ratio, the colder it was. So those two bits and pieces that we put together can tell us what the climate was like, and now we can then put those individual human species into the scene they need to be set. And so we will look at those over time and see what happened. I want to take a look at Homo erectus first. Homo erectus is the most successful human species that ever lived. Homo erectus was around for about 2 million years. Now, we've been around for about 300,000. There were other human species around for 500,000 or 600,000 years, but Homo erectus was so successful that that species survived for almost 2 million years, starting about 2 million years ago and coming down to us through the ages until about 18,000 years ago. It is very possible that some of our ancestors, our direct ancestors, that we can actually hearken back to in our genome, may have met and worked with these individuals at that point in time. Homo erectus means upright man. When the archaeology and paleoanthropology individuals first located these bones and fossils, they saw that this individual walked in an upright position, and they didn't have any other older fossils to show that, so they named him Upright Man as being the first one. We now know that by and large, most of the members of our same species, as well as our genus, and as well as some of the hominins that were our ancestors way back when, were all upright walkers. But this was a unique character at that point in time when it was discovered. One of the first recognizable members of genus Homo, and genus Homo was kind of a very narrow, not very broad definition of humans at that point in time, because a lot of this was taking place in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. For example, Neanderthals were first looked at back in 1889. And so a lot of the information we have now is within the last 120 years. And we have been doubling our information rates on these things over 10 or 15 year periods. And at this point in time now, we're getting a lot of information, particularly about these individuals. African populations that remained in Africa of Homo erectus probably are the ones that led to us and led to the other human species, such as Homo heidelbergensis and the Denisovans and some of the other ones. They had a modern gait, a modern human gait and body proportions. I should say that we have a Homo erectus gait because that particular way of walking was prevalent with Homo erectus, and we have inherited that. All these different species I show you that are in our direct lineage are characteristics that we have now. It's not that they gained and lost them. It's just we now have them all put together from some of these here. First human species to have a flat face rather than a very protruding jaw. Also had a prominent nose, no longer a flat squash nose that an ape may have or a gorilla of some kind may have. One thing I do want to point out though, and I just want to show this out there real quick, we do not come from apes. For those of you who believe we do, we have learned over the last 15 to 20 years, we do not come from apes. They come from a species that we come from that is more directly in our lineage. So essentially, for all intents and purposes, they came out of our stock. And so they are descendants of us. So next time you watch Planet of the Apes, you'll realize it's a little closer than we thought they were. Their brain capacity was interesting, depending upon the individual. Went anywhere from 600 cc's to 1250 cc's. 1250 is about as close as you can get to a modern human brain. We go anywhere between 1150 and 1500 in some cases. And so what they had was a very great difference between the sizes of the brains within these individuals. The maximum brain size they got was probably derived early on when they were young. They were not infants very long. They were not children very long. They had a very short childhood, probably because their lifespans were not as long as ours. So they didn't get a lot of parental care as they were growing. And so that part of any kind of culture they might have was lacking in their backgrounds. And so they were into the world scene very quickly from being born and had to adapt very, very quickly as well. But they were eminently capable of doing so. They really varied in size, from the upper 4 feet up to 6'1", and anywhere between 88 pounds and 150 pounds in weight. So these individuals were pretty close to the same size we are, looked differently in the face and in part of the head. But by and large, if you saw Homo erectus walking down the street with a hood on, you'd think it was a person, a regular modern Homo sapiens. And so these individuals had everything that we have now, except for the brain that we have. And one of the things we'll see there is that by and large, our changes over time as we evolved was primarily in our brain, in our frontal cortex area, and some of these other areas up in here. And that's the only differences we see between some of these species and us. The women and men may have been about the same size in the Homo erectus groups. I'm not quite sure, but a lot of the archaeological remains, the paleoanthropological studies show that by and large, they had a fairly similar size among the sexes, which is kind of unique in the animal world. The animal kingdom, generally, the males are much bigger than the females and are, occupy a different position. What we see now in our ancestors is we begin to see the egalitarian systems that we fall into as modern human beings. And one of those first ones was we are the same size as men and women. Another thing is they're associated with what we call the Acheulean stone tool industry. And that's the second stone tool industry behind what we call the Old Devon. Old Devon were the ones where they chipped a couple chips off a rock and used it as a sharp stone to cut meat off of bones. Even some Australopithecines did this. But Homo erectus began what we call the Acheulean period. As you can see on the left-hand side there, that is a hand axe, which was their tool. That is the tool they are known for. If you go anywhere in the old world, other than Australia, if you go anywhere around there, you will find these hand axes everywhere. And that's what tells us they went all around the world. Homo erectus went to every part, every corner of the old world that we know of. We keep finding these artifacts, these Acheulean stone tools that they built. They didn't have a lot of other tools, but this one was a premium tool. It was able to do everything they needed. They didn't have to have any other tools. This did everything they wanted. They could cut down trees. They could chop up animals. They could go ahead and butcher them with these particular stones. They could utilize these things for cutting meat and defleshing bones. There were a lot of purposes they could use this for, and it's a perfect instrument for that in the world they lived in. And so this is one of the reasons they survived as long as they did, because they had this tool which gave them an advantage over all the rest of the animals in the animal world. This tool that could be made at any place at any time. You don't really lose a tool like this. You may lose it physically, but you can make another one. And these individuals began to utilize these tools and pass them on from generation to generation. This tells us something. This tells us they had culture, because you do not have culture without the ability to learn. And these individuals had the ability to teach and to learn. And so their culture became what we might consider to be one of the very first human cultures in the world around us. One of the earliest human ancestors that we have, obviously, as I was saying here, capable of using fire, could organize hunting rather than going out and kind of catch as catch can, but they could organize hunting before and then follow through on it. They cared for the injured or the sick in the group. Interestingly, we find every now and then a skull or a fossil leg bone or an arm bone, because we generally don't find them whole, and they have problems. There may be an instance, for example, where one of the older members of the tribe had been hit in the head, and they had a dent in their skull at that point in time and looked like they probably weren't capable of taking care of each other yet. And what happened is the family or individuals in the group gathered around them and kept them alive, fed them and took care of them and did what they needed to do. This shows care. This shows love and caring and a group of individuals. That is something that until recently, no one realized they had. They always considered pre-humans or other human species as animals or more or less. And so what we begin to see now in the last 20 years is the things that are difficult to define, but can be determined for what we find in the field. And they utilized other things that we now also recognize as being part of genus Homo in general. They were consuming medium to large animals. And what that tells us about that is they're very good hunters. You don't go out there and kill a mammoth unless you're a very, very good hunter, or a rhino or something else that they were eating. They were definitely eating, one of the primary foods they were eating were bison, bison antiquus, and some of the others that were there in Africa, probably the precursors of Cape buffalo. And they were eating these bovines on regularly. So they were having steaks and everything else that we have too at the same time. The next member that we have here is Homo heidelbergensis. Heidelbergensis started showing up about 700,000 years ago in Africa, and is very important to our development. He was a species of genus Homo that lived in Africa and Western Asia between 700,000 and 200,000 years ago, and was, like I said, around for about 500,000 years. Another very successful human species. As we go through this too, we'll see that by and large, many of these human species have a lifespan. I think we can learn from those and try to make projections about our own human species over time. There is a lot of features that this skull shares with both Homo erectus and modern human species. And this individual, if anything, could be called a missing link. What we have here is an individual with archaic designs in their body and modern designs in their body. And so much of the things that we have, we owe directly here to Homo heidelbergensis from that period of time. His brain is between 1100 and 1400 cc's, about as large as a Homo sapien that exists now. And so by and large, we are assuming that they were capable of thought as we have thought. The brain was arranged a little bit differently. It was put together a little bit differently than ours was. And so they may have behaved slightly differently depending upon circumstances than we would do. We don't know in some cases because obviously we're not there to see it. But what we have to look at is look at their culture and to see what it shows us about not just themselves, but about us as well. The Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and us are all considered to have descended from Homo heidelbergensis. That is the one that is considered to be both a precursor in Africa as well as Western Europe and Central Asia. Heidelbergensis, once again, was another Homo sapien, or excuse me, another genus Homo that was able to transfer themselves from one place to the next as they could walk from continent to continent to continent over time, covering a long distance over very long periods of time. And they too involved in different parts of the world. What's interesting about this is there is a concept right now that Homo heidelbergensis was a little bit different in Africa, a little bit different in Europe, a little bit different in Asia, and the resulting Homo sapiens that came from those individuals are what we might be considering as to be the major races that we look at right now. And so there was some parallel evolution going on. There were individuals obviously going back and forth and that sort of thing. But what we were seeing is some parallel evolution that was happening that gave us some of the characteristics we have now that if we have any variety in our genome, it's that. The males were about 5'9", so not that much shorter than anybody, in our modern day and age, 126 pounds. That by and large, again, this is an individual that if you saw them out on the street, you would, unless you looked twice, you would never know they were not conventional Homo sapiens. The females were about 5'2" and 112 pounds. Again, that's not that big a difference in the world that we live in. It's a fairly close a male-female relationship. And we see that in genus Homo. By and large, most of the male-female sizes, depending upon the species you see, were pretty much similar. And so we had a lot of commonality between the sexes early on. Lee Berger in South Africa at Wits University has said that he believes he's found some species or some of the specimens in South Africa that are taller than 7 feet tall. Now, I would really take that with a grain of salt, big time grain of salt, because that's a lot. But Lee is also one of the luckiest paleoanthropologists that has ever lived, because he has found 2 of the new human species. And so you have to listen to what Lee says from time to time, because he is pretty sharp and he has found a lot of information. He has put together information on Australopithecines, on early Homo, and a lot of different species that 5 or 10 years ago we didn't really know much about. So when he says they were maybe 7 feet tall, you have to give it some consideration. They may have buried their dead, and that's unique from the animal world. That's something at one point in time, when we became humans, we began burying our dead because we had affiliations with them. We loved them. We missed them. In a lot of cases, what we tried to do when we buried them was prepare them for another life, an afterlife. And we would put grave goods in there. Early on, we put in flowers and maybe a few points that they may have had, spear points or other things like that, to help them go into the other world, the next world after life. And we do see this within Homo heidelbergensis. We also wonder about their ability to speak. Were they able to speak? And they probably could make controlled vocalizations. In other words, they could form sounds with their lips, tongue, and mouth, somewhat similarly to how we do it. We are the experts at that. But in retrospect, as we look at some of their genetic structures, as well as some of the aspects of their cranial features, they probably could make these controlled vocalizations. In other words, words. Oops, sorry about that. Hit backwards. They may have mimicked animal vocalizations when they were making the sounds, but that's where, by and large, speech had started much earlier on, was from different vocalizations that animals made, calls and things like that. And so this was a step towards humanity's ability to speak, and speak very well. The one thing we do above and beyond most of our ancestors is we speak very, very well. We can communicate very effectively. Some of the other ones could speak, but the ability to communicate as effectively as we can is something unique to us. And that may be why we're still here. There are no real art objects that we find among these groups or any kind of sophisticated artifacts. They did create some spear points that were different than something that Homo erectus would have built. They maintained the hand axes that they had learned from Homo erectus as well, but we don't see a real large variety of weaponry or a large variety of tools. And so we believe that they had 3 or 4 primarily basic tools that they utilized. But again, they were perfectly fine with those tools within the environment they lived in. That's all they needed to survive in the world around them. Their stone tools were similar to Homo erectus, but the hafted stone points, like I said, the spear points that they had, that they used for hunting, were something that was a little different, something new on the scene. The only thing essentially that was new on the scene that we can determine, but it was a step up. It was towards Homo sapiens, pointing much more toward Homo sapien capabilities than Homo erectus's. And so what we see is not only is their physical shape changing a little bit, but their capabilities are beginning to change as well. We didn't just inherit physical aspects, physical bodies. We inherited aspects of life that are still with us, that comes from culture, because these individuals had culture. They lived together, they had families, they cared about each other, and they lived in a world that was wonderful and majestic and mysterious at the same time. Modern humans and Neanderthals then probably inherited the stone-tipped spear from Homo heidelbergensis. Now we move on to Neanderthals. Homo sapiens Neanderthalensis. This is a new characterization. Until fairly recently, Neanderthals were considered to be a separate species from humanity. They are not. They are us, but they are us in a different form. So they are another subspecies of humanity, but by and large, we are the same species. Long, long ago, people thought we came from Neanderthals, and we do indeed have Neanderthal DNA in our systems. But by and large, what we're finding out in the last 10 years is that they are us, but modified for a cold climate. Neanderthals began to separate from Homo heidelbergensis about 450,000 years ago to 500,000 years ago in that time frame. Interestingly enough, they arrived in the world scene in Western Europe. Now, there are estimates that Neanderthals were all over Western Europe, part of Eastern Europe, some in the Middle East, but never Africa. We have not found any Neanderthal remains in Africa. There seems to be an indication that they never got there, that they evolved in Western Europe, spread out from there to a few areas fairly close by, and then proceeded to live their lives in a fairly straightforward manner. They were different than we were in a lot of ways. They were adapted to the cold, like I said. We'll look at some of those. But what we see here among these individuals is that these human beings, our cousins and nephews and nieces and everything else, were working within this world just like we were, and living almost exactly the same way that we ultimately would live as a species as well. As I said, they diverged from heidelbergensis about 450 to 500,000 years ago. One thing about them in their modifications, their genetic modifications from considered common modern Homo sapiens, these were massive individuals. These people were large, and I don't mean large in the sense of tall. Some of the tallest ones were about 6 feet tall, but by and large, they're about 5'2" or 5'3". But their musculature and their bone structure was huge. These individuals do really well in the NFL. These would make great linemen. And what's interesting about Neanderthals is the methodologies they used to live in the world around them came from their size, from their mass, because they were strong, very, very strong. And so they were ambush hunters. And they'd hide behind a tree, and when a deer came by, they'd jump out and wrestle it down to the ground and break its neck. And they tried to do that with an elk and everything, other animals. They were ambush hunters. And what happened is you don't find very many Neanderthal remains, very many fossil skeletons that don't have broken bones. Almost all Neanderthal fossils that you find have somewhere in their body some broken bones that broke and then healed among both men and women. And so what that tells us about this is both men and women were hunting together, living together, running a family together, probably the most egalitarian society we've ever had. Within the world around them, they were equals, which is fascinating. Here is the skeletal structure. As you can take a look here and see that they were very, very much more massive than we are. Our rib cage essentially goes straight down with a tiny bit of flare. Their rib cage went essentially straight down and then flared way out because they contained a lot of muscle in and around the base of their stomach. They were very heavily boned, heavily limbed. The muscular structures were much more unique than ours. They were much more geared to their lives in the cold, cruel world they lived in. And they lived in a very cold world. They lived in a world of darkness, not only because of the cold in the winters, but because Western Europe was one solid forest all the way across. And so they lived in those forests, ambush hunting. They could see better than we could. Their eyes were better developed than ours were. There's a spot in the back of their skull called the occipital bun, where some of their structure of their capability of seeing ended up. And a lot of that structure in there is much more complex than ours. And so we know they can see farther than we could. They could see better in low light, and they could focus a lot further than we could. So their eyesight was super deluxe. So a little bit shorter, but more robust than us. The brain mass, which is very interesting, was between 1,200 and 1,750 cc's. That's bigger than ours. The 1,200 to 1,400 is our range, some 1,500 as well. But getting up to 1,750, that's bigger than ours. And it's interesting because it was built differently than ours was as well in some respects. One of those is the vision centers, like I talked about. They were much more complex than ours were. There were other parts of the brain that was a little more developed in some ways. And so it's a lot more interesting to take a look at some of these individuals. And, you know, people, when they first come into my class in a lot of cases, say, well, they have a bigger brain, they must be smarter. And it's, well, it's not how big the brain is, it's how it's built. It's the way it's structured, you know, the way the brain folds upon itself and the way that the synapses work is what is important, not so much the size. And so by and large, these masses that they had, these larger massive brains that they had, may not have made them smarter, but different in a little way. So for 25,000 years, as humans went to Western Europe about 50,000 years ago, we lived side by side with our cousins, and we lived side by side with our brothers and sister Neanderthals, obviously interbreeding and working and living together in some cases. Sometimes we do find some remnants of Homo sapiens materials laid behind when we find a Neanderthal site. In many cases, they'll be on top of each other. So in sometimes the Neanderthals lived there, and then the Homo sapiens may come in after the Neanderthals were there. But we occupied the same areas at about the same time. And so for 25,000 years, we were together with no problem whatsoever. And then 30,000 years ago, it disappeared. They went from species that lived in the world around them to becoming extinct in a fairly short period of time, to so quickly that it's difficult to really knock in what time frame they disappeared in. And so what we see there is that 30,000 year period, 28,000 years in some people's estimate. We find a few remnants of the Neanderthals in Gibraltar. And down there by the Rock of Gibraltar, there are cave systems in the Rock of Gibraltar that they lived in at that period of time. And so they disappeared. So what happened? People have said that maybe there was a war. We wiped them out. Well, we lived side by side for 25,000 years. I'm pretty sure that we were kind of used to each other by that point in time. And so Neanderthals were never populous. There were not a lot of Neanderthals in the world. They were a very low population group of individuals. Their breeding rates were low. Families maybe had one, maybe two children. That's it. They didn't have more than that because they couldn't afford to have children. They lived in an environment that was very, very difficult to survive in. And the fewer numbers they had, the better the resource use was. And so Neanderthals, by and large, were low population centers where they lived. So did the climate kill them off? Did the environment kill them off? The environment that they were adapted to, that they evolved in, the climate they survived in for 300,000-400,000 years? The climate was the same as it's been. That was during one of the periods of the last glacial epoch. And nothing had really changed. Physically, they didn't change. Climate was about the same, cold. And so that doesn't seem very possible. Did disease come about that knocked them down? Some have said that Homo sapiens, as they moved into Western Europe, brought new diseases from Africa and other places and introduced those to Neanderthals. And that could have happened to some degree. But again, 25,000 years, it's, you know, it's if they did pick some up, it would have been later in that period of time where some Homo sapiens were coming out of Africa 30,000 years ago and 40,000 years ago, much more recently than some of the earlier cases that were going. And maybe they brought some later on. Maybe they did. It's hard to say. Perhaps hybridization had something to do with it. The fact that we could hybridize, that a conventional Homo sapiens man and a Neanderthal woman, or vice versa, could produce a child that was capable then of reproducing itself, which means we're the same species. And so what may have happened is we are a much larger family type of species. We have more children. We can take care of more children based on some of the techniques and the tools that we have that they didn't have. And so what may have happened is we may have just outnumbered them ultimately. We may have bred them out of existence in a way where they more and more, there would have been fewer and fewer children that were purely Neanderthal. And there are a lot of characteristics that we have that may have been overtaxing the Neanderthal genome. And so that is one of the aspects that's probably most likely, is that kind of hybridization that was taking place. It doesn't take very long to change a population if every generation is hybridized. It doesn't take very long at all. A couple hundred years and you've got a totally different model out there, a new human model out there. And so the hybridization may have been a real big part of it. Or was it a combination of some of those? A picture I've just drawn up there is a fossil that was found of a Neanderthal woman, and all we have is the pelvis and part of the leg in the hip there, and inside that pelvis, inside that particular fossil, was an infant, or I should say a fetus, pretty close to term, if not at term. And one of the problems here that we're seeing in some of these individuals, the hybrids were shaped differently than the conventional children of the species, and this pelvic structure was a little bit different between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. And so what may have happened is a lot more stillbirths or deaths during birth, childbirth. That could have been something that took place in these hybridizations. There are not very many of these particular examples that come up, but it's something that makes some kind of sense, and it's something we're still looking for. Is these kinds of hybridizations may have made it just difficult enough that ultimately they could not survive as a subspecies. Let's move now over to Denisova Cave. We've talked about the Denisovans. A lot of people have not heard about the Denisovans. That's because we haven't known a lot about them until about the last 20 years. We have found in the literature and in some of the studies that were put together some information that was generated by individuals in Denisova Cave and some of the hominin remains they found there. They did find some remains dated to about 41,000 years ago in this cave. Different remains than what we have seen in the past among Neanderthals. These weren't Neanderthals. They lived in that area. Neanderthals were there as well, but this is a different group of individuals. What's really difficult about this is we haven't found a lot. 2008, there was a little tiny second bone that was found of a girl's pinky finger. And then it was genomically sequenced in 2009. The good thing was it was still bone. It wasn't ossified. It wasn't fossilized. It was still bone, so they could generate the DNA sequences on those in the analysis of that bone. They also had a couple of molars to work with. One they found in 2000, another one in 2010. And they were able to sequence the genome of the Denisovans, Homo denisova. And what they found was very, very interesting. This was a group of people that were similar to the Neanderthals in some ways. A lot of the same physical characteristics, because they were living in the north, in areas in north central or northeastern Europe and parts of western Russia. And they were living in a climate similar to what the Neanderthals were in. And so they had very similar physical characteristics. That is a cold-based human being is what that is those types of structures, those large body structures. But they were a different species. They were, I should say, a different subspecies. Neanderthals and Denisovans were able to breed and able to produce individuals. And as well as Homo sapiens could breed with them as well by the time they got to Asia. So what we see here is a species of human being on the planet from very little information. This is the one thing in our field that is so exciting, is if all we have to do is find a little bit, just a little bit of organic material, and we can learn all about those individuals. We know what their eye color were. We knew how tall they are. We knew what they were like. Something like this. Individuals, interestingly enough, that have some Asian characteristics in their genome, which is different than the Neanderthals have. And we now believe, based on the map you see on the right-hand side, that the Neanderthals, as they moved up into the Denisovan areas, brought some genetics with them, imparted those into the Denisovan population, and then the Denisovan population began to move and migrate eastward and southeastward. They got all the way to New Guinea by the time that they had progressed all the way down there. And once again, a lot of Asian individuals have part of their genome locked up in Denisovans. Interestingly enough, their ability to cross large open bodies of water was something that humanity has been doing for a long time. Here is a brief tree, I guess, family tree, for lack of a better term, showing Homo heidelbergensis that we've been talking about from 500,000 years ago. Seeing that 300,000, 250,000 year time frame in the middle there where the Denisovans and the Neanderthals split. And so the Denisovans and Neanderthals were more similar to each other. Modern humans, not quite so much. But that's about the same time frame that we're looking at for our evolution to take place, and give us some information about what we were like then as well. October 2015, we saw National Geographic came out with an article called Almost Human. Lee Berger, to the right, who I call the luckiest paleoanthropologist in the world, because he has found two new species, one species of human and one species of Australopithecine. And so he didn't find just a few bones, he found thousands. So Lee has been looking at this new human species from the caves that they were derived in South Africa, where they found them, and working through their genetics as well as how they lived. Kind of a difficult group of individuals to place because the locations that we find them in are so unique and different. Homo naledi is this new species from about 300,000 years ago. Time frame is difficult because we don't have a lot of things to date in the caves they were found, because their bones, whether fossilized or organic, were laying on the top of the cave floor. There's nothing on top of them to date. You can't date the material under them because the material could have been there for 1 million years before somebody died there. And so it's hard to date these individuals. And so, for example, the skeleton to the right there, which is one of the more complete ones, trust me, this is a very complete skeleton for paleoanthropology, gave us some good indications of what they were like physically, but it was difficult to figure out when and where they were coming from because we found them in this one cave. On the left of the picture here, you see some cavers trying to get down into the cave where they found Homo naledi. The cave width of the entryway into the cave they found them is 8 inches. And so when Lee had to get archaeologists to crawl down in that cave to look at these bones, he had to get people in there like 4'8" to get in there, because they were the only ones that could get in there. And they crawl down into this 8-inch wide crevice down into this cave, drop down to the floor of the cave, and realized they were standing on bones, that the entire floor of the cave was bones. And so what that told the archaeologist was there's a lot of those individuals that ended up down in there. Off to the right is kind of an interpretation of what it may have looked like, where the Homo naledi individuals were taking their dead, carrying them into these caves, putting them into these 8-inch accesses. I think just based on the way the bones were laying in there, they stuffed them into those accesses, and then they would degrade a little bit and fall down in there and become skeletonized down in the cave. But we find so many bones down in there of many, many individuals, dozens of individuals in this one cave system that had been spelunked for 100 years. Cavers used to go in this particular cave for 100 or more years, like Tongue River Cave that we have here in Sheridan area. And somehow this particular room was overlooked, and these fossils had never been touched. I get kind of excited about this because this is all brand new stuff, and it's and the direction that paleoanthropology is going is so fantastic. Homo naledi, during the first round of collection on these bones I was talking about on the bottom of the floor of the cave, produced a lot of different bones. We have the one skeleton there that's pretty well intact, not too bad. There's other craniums there, as you can see up along there, and we have more rib bones, and we have more leg and arm and fingers and all that sort of stuff that are kind of disassociated because they broke up as they were crumbling down into the cave system and being there. But there was enough there to realize that not only was this a new species, but it was a different kind of species, a different kind of Homo than we'd looked at. Interestingly enough, one that existed the same time we did, but was really different than us. You know, we've talked about Neanderthals and we've talked about heidelbergensis, and all of those were more similar to us than naledi was. It looks like naledi was probably an offshoot of humanity, one that was going down a dead end. But it gave us also an example of something that evolved fairly recently that could give us some really interesting characteristics. The features of humanity they had was like a humanesque skull. The shape of the skull was pretty advanced, kind of like ours was. The brain case was only about half of what ours was, but it was pretty well organized and a pretty good structure. Their hands were versatile. The palms of the hands, the different parts of the hand, like the thumb and the wrists, are very human-like, which suggested tool use. We have long legs on this individual here. Long, slender, strong muscle attachments. They could run. They had a bipedal gait, and like Homo erectus and the other genus Homo, beyond that, he could run. Human-like feet, once another methodology to show us that they could run. Our human feet are built for running. That is what we are built to do physically. We chase our game down. That is why we have survived in the world for as long as we have as a group of species. The feet were almost indistinguishable from ours, very, very similar. On the other hand, some of these ancient characteristics they have was they had a primitive shoulder in there. The shoulder was positioned in such a way that would have helped with crawling up into trees, going from limb to limb. So the shoulder allowed them to be more arboreal than we were. The pelvis is quite flared compared to ours. Ours is very cup-like. Their pelvis is pretty flared. It's a very primitive trait and much shorter from front to back than ours are. And having curved fingers, very long curved fingers that let them then be more ape-like when they were in the trees, but yet they had the characteristics of being more human-like when they were on the ground. So they're an interesting species. Interestingly, diverged from our lineage to the point where they have these new characteristics that started showing up. And this is a pretty good example of convergent evolution, where you start going backwards in some cases to evolve into another form that was once prevalent. Island of Flores, Indonesia, 2003, in Liang Bua Cave. They encountered a hominin fossil in this particular cave, one that had never been seen before. And one that was really difficult to determine what they were like. They were an island species. And an island species, other than Homo erectus, had never really been located up until this point in time. By and large, most of the species we saw are primarily terrestrial species on mainlands. And what they began to see in this new fossil that they discovered was some different characteristics than they'd seen in the past. They named her Homo floresiensis. The meaning person living on the island of Flores. Flo was the name of the individual they first found. She was about 3.5 feet tall, 55 pounds. Not a very big individual. As they found more and more of these individuals in the cave floor, they found that these were very short, very gracile individuals. They were essentially small and light, and they were living on these islands, predominantly Flores and some of the other smaller and local islands, as groups of individuals that have been there for a very long period of time. And what's interesting is they were small for a reason. When you find species that are evolved on islands, there's what's called island dwarfism. There are not a lot of resources on islands. There's not as much food. There are not as many resources of places to live, for example. There's not as much diversity among the plants. So there's not as much vegetable matter that you can process for food. And so what happens on islands is species that survive shrink. They get smaller because they don't have the resources. They shrink down to adapt to the resources they do have. And so we find this particular species is like a small version of Homo erectus in a lot of ways. They were called the hobbits because of their small size. What's interesting about this, the hobbits is that these individuals actually were around for a long enough time to have actually gone into a period of time where we were around big time. This is a skull of the particular individual that we were looking at here. Very modern looking in some ways, in a lot of cases. The brain was only 350 cc's, about a third to a quarter of what ours is like. But the structure, the architecture was much more similar to our modern brains, which is very interesting. The brain size to mass of the individual ratio was not as important in this as the shape of the brain itself, as the structure of the brain. The Brodmann's area 10, for example, was available, as you can see up there on the where the red dot has come up on the forehead. That area is almost identical to ours. It is an area that is involved with memory recall. That is vital as far as surviving in the world around you. Very vital in determining how you survive as a species, how your culture survives and how it lives. And so what we find here is the structure of the skull and the brain that lived inside of it is enough to tell us they had culture and they could pass information on from generation to generation. There was just as much Homo as we were. They were just built a little bit differently. They would have been fascinating to have known, I think. Stone tools they found in those horizons, the range from 94,000 to 13,000 years ago. 13,000 years ago is the same time the agricultural revolution was getting started, which means that our recent ancestors were around. Our recent ancestors knew these people. And so it's fascinating then when you look at different resources that you find in cultures all over the world that talk about little people. And though people don't really understand how long stories can survive, one of the things I teach my classes is we find evidence that stories that are passed on from generation to generation to generation, the myths and the tales, survive for tens of thousands of years. Take my class if you want to learn exactly how that works. It's pretty interesting. So we have a lot of information from our fairly recent past. This is one of them. These are the little people. Homo luzonensis is the most recent discovered genus Homo individual that we have. First remains were discovered in 2007, northern Luzon, which is the island Luzon in the Philippines. It was an unknown hominid at the time that it was found. They found 12 more species in specimens in 2019, and then they reassigned then the remains of all these individuals to Homo luzonensis, put it in genus Homo, and named it for the island it was found in. Lived between 770,000 years ago and 50,000 years ago. Had a very well-developed culture that we can determine based on what we find. They may also have gotten smaller over time because they were also island dwellers. And they may also have over time become dwarf individuals based on the limited resources they had. The finger bones are interesting. They're long, narrow, they're curved, which we see in Australopithecus. And yet the foot bones are just like Homo. And so they're almost, the foot bones are not like Homo. They're more or less indistinguishable from Australopithecus. Their foot has gone backwards as far as the kind of foot that was being utilized by species at that point in time. Of course, the youngest species of all of them is us. We're still around, thankfully, and we've been around for quite a long period of time. The earliest Homo sapiens were located on a hillside in Morocco during a highway construction. You'd be amazed at the stuff that's found during highway constructions. I think most of the paleoanthropologists and archaeologists find their things when highways are being built. It's every time a highway is built, you find stuff, which is pretty cool. So this is an area between Marrakesh and the Atlantic Ocean in northwestern Africa. This was not initially classified as a genus Homo site because no one from genus Homo had ever been found in northwestern Africa. Just weren't there. South Africa, East Africa, but not northwestern Africa. And this place called Jebel Hirhoud was a mine. It was a quarry, getting rock for the highway that they were building there that was opened in the 1960s. So when they first found the human remains in there in the 60s, they thought they were Neanderthals and they dated them to 40,000 years ago. And so for a long period of time, there these bones sat in the back corner of a museum somewhere in Morocco, kind of going to seed, because nobody was very interested in them because they were only 40,000-year-old Neanderthals, not realizing that they were found in Africa No Neanderthals had ever been found in Africa. The shape of the skull, first of all, was wrong for late Neanderthals. It wasn't correct. It was much more globular, much more like ours in a lot of ways. The brow ridge wasn't as pronounced as Neanderthal. There were a lot of features that were not Neanderthal. No skeleton, as I said, has ever been found in Africa of Neanderthals. No, neither here nor there. They may have gone there, but none have ever been found. Neanderthals were cave dwellers. That is where they lived. That's where you look for them. If you want to find a Neanderthal anywhere in the world, get in a cave and go look for them. And so the caves of Africa have been explored, but no Neanderthals have shown up. The people that were discovered there were Homo sapiens, early Homo sapiens. Some anthropologists think they may have just been a transitional stage between some archaic type of Homo sapien and us. And others say they were directly in our line, that these individuals were our forebears. They just were adapted for a desert environment, kind of like the Homo neanderthalensis were adapted to a cold environment. If anything, they're a middle stage of individuals that were kind of stuck between a common ancestor like heidelbergensis and our modern humans. But at this point in time, we call them Homo sapiens. They are an archaic version, but they are us 325,000 years ago. So we ask the question now, why are we still here? We've seen 8 different species that were here in the last 300,000 years. We lived together for hundreds of thousands of years. We worked together. We had families together. We did everything together in a lot of cases. We must have shared cultures because we were transmitting information about different technologies from one to the other. What happened? Where did they go? Why did they go? Were we smarter? I don't know. Neanderthals had a larger brain in some cases than we did. Maybe they were smarter than we were. Hard to say. Were we faster than they were? No, we're probably about the same as all the other genus Homo individuals at that time. We were all about the same speed. Were we stronger? Nope, we definitely weren't stronger. Neanderthals were very much stronger. Was there a sense of altruism that existed within a group of individuals that would have made their survival longer and better because we took care of each other? We see the evidence of that in Homo erectus and Neanderthals as well. And so the aspects of altruism are there early on in our development. So that wasn't it. Or was it something else? Was it something almost harder to define, harder to locate in the fossil record, harder to locate when we're looking at them physically and trying to interpolate what's taking place? Was it foresight and planning through different stages, through a mature culture? Was it the ability to take information, ingest the information, and then come up with something new and different? Is that what it was? Because we can do that. We don't know that they could. They had culture. They had intelligence. They had all kinds of aspects of life that we look at that would help them live. But as far as we know, this aspect of the ability to project into the future, to make decisions based on something that doesn't happen, it hasn't happened, to make decisions on something we can't see, to make decisions on things that may or may never happen, but something we need to know about, may have been unique to us. Because over time, we continue to evolve. None of our ancestors did. They got to a point, all the ones I've gotten done talking about, they got to a point and that was it. They stopped. Neanderthals were the same way for 250 to 300,000 years. Same points, same everything. They hunted the same way. They did everything the same way. All of these different ancestors we're talking about did that, except for us. We got to a point where we started building technology. It took us a while. It took us a long while, several 100,000 years. We were pretty much along in the same lines as everybody else that we were living with. But about 80, 70,000 years ago, we began looking at things differently. For some various and sundry reasons I don't want to get into here, but we started looking at things differently. We started valuing each other. We began to communicate with each other and respect each other for the ability to communicate. And then we developed technology. Our technology of the atlatl, which is a spear thrower, and the bow is a different technology than any other ancestors had. We had the ability to kill from a distance. We had the ability to get our meat in almost any environment, whereas our ancestors couldn't. Our ancestors were stuck in the environment they were at. If things changed, if the climate changed, if the environment changed, they had no tools to adapt. They couldn't survive in some of those areas. We could. We could get game anywhere. We could find game. We could plan the hunts. We could determine where we were going to go, who was going to go, why they were going to go there. We could put all this together with our technology and advance our species and cover the planet. Not just the old world, but the new world as well. Our species is the only one that's been on this continent that we know of. And so this may be why we're still here, is because we can do those things those other ancestors could not. We could progress anywhere, and we can still do that. And so it's going to be interesting about everything we have right now in looking at all these different ancestors is how we're going to turn out. Where are we going to go? Because we are the evolving species. We are the species that evolves continuously. We change ourselves. We evolve ourselves over time. One last caveat before I shut down. This caveat is there aren't quite 8 species at the time that these lived. There's another one we don't know about yet. It's in our genome. There's a species in our genome we haven't found yet, but they're there and we'll find them someday. That's what keeps me going in this particular task of mine, is they're still out there waiting discovery, another family member to find. And so we look at the genetics, we look at the DNA now, we utilize the old techniques and the new techniques and put that stuff all together to come up with the answers that we find. Where will we go? Will our brain continue to evolve? That's the only direction we're going essentially now, is our brain continues to evolve. Our physical structure, our physical shape is adequate, but everything we do is still geared towards learning and advancing that way. And so I believe, given certain circumstances, we'll be around for a long, long time because we can control it. Thank you very much.
That was absolutely fascinating, BJ. Thank you so much for presenting that for us. We do have some questions. So whenever you're ready for questions, I'll go ahead and start with the first question.
I'm never ready for questions, but go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to do my best to pronounce everything. Okay, so you were on the slide that talked about Homo heidelbergensis.
Yeah,
is that correct?
heidelbergensis. Yep.
Okay, right. And we have 2 questions from that slide from Hannah. If their bodies were nearly identical to our own, except for our brains, how is their debits only consist of meats that they hunted? And then how did they get the nutrients their bodies needed?
Okay, based on the points they have and the structure we find, I didn't talk about spears. Very important. Homo erectus had them, not very advanced, but they had them. Neanderthals had them. Homo heidelbergensis had them, and we had them. That tool allowed them to really diversify their meat. They were able to eat a couple of different species that they could, spear. You can throw a spear fairly accurately over, a short enough distance that you can get some, deer and some other species. They were able to get more species to eat than some of the other humans could do. So that particular piece of technology allowed them a greater variety of on a menu, so to speak. And then the vegetative species, they're fairly simple: root crops, nuts, fruits, and berries in the spring, in the summer. And so their diet was pretty diverse. It was probably as good or better than ours in some ways.
Okay, excellent. Next question also comes from Hannah. You were talking about the difficulty in dating fossils when you find human remains. And the question that she asked is, so then how are they dated? How can we measure their time frame of existence?
That's an entire lecture from one of my classes. So we know in studying radioactive decay in rocks that as elements decay over time, uranium, for example, decays into lead over time. The decay is even. It's always the same rate. There's a period of time when the decay has gone to the point where half of the original element is now, for example, when I'm using uranium and half lead. That half-life's about 4.3 billion years. We start looking then at the elements that we find these fossils in, at the stones, the sand grains, all that stuff. We find these different radioactive elements that occur naturally. They're in our soil. They're everywhere around us. Uranium is one of the most common elements that we live with in our backyards. It's just so disseminated, it doesn't do anything. We utilize that then. We take those materials and see how many half-lives have occurred in that element since that was laid down. And there are specific types of elements we can use, strontium, iridium. There are others that we can utilize for that kind of determination. All we have to do is how many half-lives it was, and then we just multiply by the number that the half-life is. And so you'll ultimately, if it's been 10 half-lives, then it's 10 times the number of one half-life. So if it's 5,000 years, then 10 half-lives are 50,000 years. So if it has degraded that much since the fossil was put down, that's how old the fossil is. We can actually, we can analyze the fossils themselves if there's bone structure. Carbon 14.
Okay, very good. The next question is from Paige. Can you briefly explain how we study language development in early species?
I think the people that really are focused on that these days, the anthropologists or primatologists, study apes and monkeys. We've had some phenomenal examples of some primatology that's taken place to try to determine how well they communicate, or can they communicate. They don't learn human languages. Shouldn't say that. I'll stop. They can't speak human languages. They can actually learn a whole bunch of them, but they can't speak. They don't have the structures to speak. We have aspects of our physiology that allows us to speak, the way our tongue is shaped and the muscles of the tongue in the mouth. We have a structure down here called the hyoid bone that helps us to produce sounds that we produce. And the only other species that has had that we know of are Neanderthals. So primates and earlier monkeys and that sort of thing don't have any of that stuff. So even if they know they could learn the language, they couldn't say anything. So what we do is we find out how they communicate. Obviously, a lot of animals communicate by calls, where they'll sound out, right? They're in the jungle somewhere, and all of a sudden you'll hear an animal break out with a call of some kind. And the more evolved organisms have much more complex calls. But what we do know is we can utilize body language, for lack of a better term, body language, in order for primates to communicate with us better. And so as we look at these different systems of calls, the inability to actually pronounce the speech, we have found over time that the more advanced species, such as the chimps and the gorillas, are able to understand a lot more than we know they are. And they can then utilize body language in their ability to learn further. In fact, some of the gorillas have learned so much. They have these boards that have these symbols on them. Coco the gorilla was one of the ones that had that. Look up Coco if you're interested. And what they have is they've learned over 700 words in some cases and that sort of thing. And they can communicate utilizing those boards. They'll just press the button on the board, and they'll come up with material or information that helps them understand what's going on. One of the interesting things is the gorillas are far enough advanced in language, better than a lot of the chimps. They can actually pass it on. Some of the gorillas that have learned, like Coco and some of the other ones, have been put back among gorillas from time to time, and not just kept in a laboratory. They're living in some cases in Africa, and they've been seen to start teaching the other wild gorillas sign language and body language, and trying to teach them how to do it. So that's amazing smarts. That is the kind of intelligence that we never knew about. I mean, apes were just dirty, hairy things. They're very, very, very firmly capable of communicating.
Next question. This one's from Jake. What is your opinion of how the meteor that struck the Hiawatha Glacier in Greenland about 13,000 years ago may have affected the outcome on younger Dryas, I hope I pronounced that the right way, in North America, and how it may have changed the history of what is considered the first humans in North America? He further adds vast, quick melting, floods, sudden rising water levels, destruction of the food supplies. How do you think, and then he asked another question, how do you think the Bighorn Mountains were changed during this impact for survival of humans?
That is a big topic. I actually have researched that myself. A friend of mine also researched the glacial aspects of the Bighorn Mountains, so that's correct. The glaciers up in the Bighorns, well, they're still there. Not very big, but they're still there. The Younger Dryas period is something it had such an impact on the world around it. What happened was, short story, is that the climate suddenly got colder because of events that took place about 12,800 years ago. Bolids came in. Those were the meteors and other aspects of materials are falling out of the sky, landing all over the place. And there was a whole cluster of them that came in and created a lot of ash in the atmosphere and other things. What's interesting about that too is the agricultural revolution in the old world, the habitation of our continent all was set back because of that. And so what we saw happen in our continent, for example, there were groups of individuals that came here, in some cases may have been as long as 50,000 years ago, during one of the periods of time that the glaciers were no longer advancing. What happened is, about the point in time the Younger Dryas is kicking into gear, those particular individuals that were on this continent died off, and the only ones left were the Native American groups that came across 14,000, 13,000 years ago. And I could go into a whole long litany here about the Solutrean period and stuff like that, but it's simple to say that the Younger Dryas affected the world. And it set a lot of things back, but it also facilitated a lot of things as well, because what happened at the end there when it warmed back up is that Israel became I'll just say it, a Garden of Eden. Israel was one of those areas in the Fertile Crescent that after the Younger Dryas was heaven on earth to the people living there. There was so much food, they were falling over each other to get food. So yeah, I don't know that answered the question, but it's that time period is really a lot of flux going on.
Okay, very good. And we're at the last question now. This one is from Elizabeth. How do you know the muscles and body mass? Also, how can you tell what they look like with components of hair, eyes, mouth, shape, etc.?
Okay. That's one of the areas that I don't know a lot. Well, I don't know a lot about because it's very technical. There are individuals, anthropologists, that are osteoanthropologists that know about bones. There are physical anthropologists that know about anatomy. And what they can do is they can take bone structures and infer from the bones where all the muscles were, where the ligaments were, where the tendons were, and can build everything back, put it all back together again, given the bone. As long as you can find the bones, and the skeletal structures, you can build the body. There are some aspects of it that are just guesses. Skin color is a guess. By and large, we were black for most of our period that we were alive on the planet, primarily because most of us lived in Africa for a pretty long period of time, and you can't survive in Africa unless you have a lot of melanin in your skin and you have a dark skin. So the light-skinned individuals did not do very well in Africa and went north. So it looks like, for example, Neanderthals may have been black to start with, and then based on what was taking place in their environment, may have lightened up. The melanin may have gotten less and less. The computers now take all the information that these previous anthropologists have utilized in an analog basis. They literally built them with their hands. They would take a bone and build that stuff with their hands using clay and string and that sort of thing. And what happens now is they put it all into a computer. And what it does then, it fleshes out the skeletons. And the hair and some of the features can now be determined from the genetics, because the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, we don't have any Homo erectus or any of those, unfortunately. We can use the DNA to determine what the eye color was, what the hair color was, and some of the other aspects that it shows up in the DNA. And so now we've got a really good idea of what Neanderthals look like. We have a very good idea of what some of the, believe it or not, the Denisovans with no remains looked like. And so that, on top of being able to determine what the body was like based on the skeleton, put that together, we get a pretty good idea what they looked like. What's interesting about it is, I can remember when I was a kid decades ago, and I would be reading my archaeology books when I was 7 or 8 years old, 9 years old, and everything was described as old, hairy, big, stupid pre-humans, that sort of thing. What we're finding now, as we learn more and more and more about these individuals, is we all look pretty much the same. We were all pretty much hairless. That goes all the way back to the Australopithecines. We were skin type. I mean, the surface of the skin, the way we have the pores and all the rest of that stuff. We've had that for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. And so when we put that all together, now we see individuals depicted as a Homo erectus, as a Neanderthal, and they look a lot like us, which is pretty darn interesting. And they look realistic. If you ever get a chance to get into some of this, heck, get on Google and Google some of these past lineages up and go through the images, and the modern stuff that's built on the computer is phenomenal. It's just amazing. It just shows you how much we look alike, even though it's been, in some cases, 2 million years with Homo erectus.
Okay, thank you, BJ. That was the last question. Do you have any final comments that you would like to give to the audience before we conclude this evening?
It's interesting to me that I have a different worldview than I used to have from when I was young. I think it really started in the late 90s when I was in New York. And my wife and daughter and I were in New York, and we went to the Natural History Museum there in New York, and they had Lucy on display. Lucy is the Australopithecus that was found, and it was one of the first Australopithecines that had been found back a long time ago. And they had her on display, and I got to looking at Lucy, who's 3.2 million years old. And I wondered if that was somebody that may have been related to me in the past. I can't describe it, but it was almost a visceral feeling. It was like, oh my gosh, we go back a long way. And that really kicked into gear to take my paleontology background, which was all bugs and birds and things like that, and advance that and look at people instead. And by doing that, I've kind of come to see the world in a different way, that we're all related, that we all want the same things. We're all ultimately come from the same stock. And to me, it's been a real eye-opening experience. I think I've gotten a real good feeling about humanity because of it. So that's kind of esoterical, but it really is, it's what it's all about. There's something deep inside me that really responds to that.
Well, thank you, BJ. It was a wonderful lecture, and we certainly did enjoy it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending our lecture this evening. Please forward any comments to the Sheridan College Foundation via email to scfoundation@sheridan.edu. That's scfoundation@sheridan.edu. For more information on upcoming events through Sheridan College, check out our website at www.sheridan.edu or our Sheridan College Facebook page. This concludes our webinar for this evening. Thank you for attending.
There. Well.
Okay, so we're still on live, still recording. Very good, BJ. Thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting now.